My name is Samantha Birk. I'm the Program Manager for Higher Education with IMS Global, and I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to this afternoon's presentation and discussion. As we get started, we do have a couple of polls that we would like to get some of your feedback on. Carrie, you want to go ahead and open the first poll question while we're waiting for some folks to come on? So the first poll question, I'll give you about 60 seconds to answer this, is does your institution have an adaptive learning initiative, or do any of your departments use an adaptive learning product? Yes or no. So you just take a couple of seconds to respond. That would be great. While you folks are doing that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. I am very pleased to introduce Dale Johnson, who's the Adaptive Program Manager with Arizona State University, and Dr. Jon Mott, who is the Chief Learning Officer with Learning Objects and Cengage Learning. So Dale, Jon, would you like to share a little bit about each yourselves, why we are collecting some results from this first poll?
Yes, welcome everyone. This is Dale Johnson. I've been at Arizona State for about 5 years, and we have been working our way through a number of different disciplines. We'll be telling you about our work today with Cengage Learning Objects. We've also worked with a number of other vendors in the space, and we're excited to tell you about the findings that we have and describe a little bit of the process that we've gone through. And Jon, you want to introduce yourself as well? You might be on mute.
I am now unmuted. So goal one of the day accomplished. Yeah, my name is Jon Mott. I'm with Learning Objects. I've also been with Learning Objects about 5 years, and we've been working with Arizona State, and I've worked closely with Dale over the last handful of years on several projects, and excited to talk about our collaboration on economics and some of the very exciting results we've seen there.
So to give you some context for this call, we started working with Cengage about 4 years ago and initially did a project in psychology. We worked with them to develop an adaptive program based on their MindTap software. Eventually we switched over to Learning Objects and redeveloped that course. We'll talk about that today, and we've since built microeconomics and macroeconomics as well. So I see some poll results. It looks like about 13 people of the 48 have some experience with it, with adaptive software, so that's good. Feel free to submit questions using the chat box, or if you'd like during the presentation, you can also, I believe, submit questions directly to the administrators.
So before we dive right into it, we do have one other poll question. Kara, can you go ahead and release number 2? So one of the things, for those of you that may have adaptive learning products on your institution, we're sort of curious as to what disciplines that your institution is focused on with adaptive learning. If you could take that minute to respond to that poll while Dale gets started with the slides, that would be terrific.
Super. Thanks, Sam. So I want to start at the results so that you get a sense of what's happened and why we're excited about this model of using adaptive courseware and active learning in combination. We developed a microeconomics course and launched it last fall, and we had data from our previous semesters. So we looked back, and holding assessment, curriculum, and instructor the same, we saw a dramatic improvement in the results of the first exam. This was an early indicator that we were headed in the right direction with this technology and the pedagogy that we work with. And if you look carefully at these results, you'll see that the shift here is very dramatic, whereas in the fall of 16, approximately 38% of the students had gotten either a D or an E on this exam. By the fall of 17, it was down to 11%, and the vast majority of students were getting A's on the exam. So we were excited. The faculty were eager to analyze this data, so we started looking at it almost right away as the information started flowing out of learning objects. Then we looked at the total course results after the end of the semester, and we again saw a very positive trend here. If you look at the fall of 16, our withdrawal rate was about 15%, and our pass rate, that is success of A, B, or C, was 69%. And in the fall of 17, we reduced the withdrawal rate to 10%, and we increased the success rate to 79%. So very positive trends. The faculty are very satisfied with that. And we focus on these two indicators, the persistence and the performance, as the way to evaluate the overall success of the course. Now, I want to talk a little bit about adaptive courseware and put it into context so you have some materials that you can take away and share with your colleagues at your universities. The layperson's description of adaptive courseware is deliver the right lesson to the right student at the right time. And it's very easy to say and very difficult to do, but I thought it would be important to share that with you because it's usually the first question that we get when we start discussing this with a faculty member or a department chair or a dean. And that's the simplest way that I know of to describe this. Now, why are we trying to, oh, go ahead, Sam.
Yes, so Dale, we did have a question come in before we kind of move into the why ASU is doing this.
Sure.
How many students were in the adaptive course compared to a traditional course?
Yeah, in our adaptive courses, we use the same course section size. It's 190 students in a large lecture hall. So we don't, in the case of economics, we didn't change any of the parameters around the enrollment in the class. We have experimented with some other models. I'll talk a little bit about that since the question came in, where we use smaller section sizes as part of this model. But in this case, for both psychology and economics, we had fairly large section sizes.
Okay, thank you.
So what we're doing with the technology and the active adaptive approach is trying to transform what has traditionally been a mass production model where faculty members have a very difficult time answering basic questions like who needs help, what do they need help with, and what's the best way to help, to something that's much more focused on the learner and what I refer to as a mass personalization process. The goal is to deliver this student the right information to be successful. And as part of that transformation, the adaptive courseware is an integral piece of that new design. Now, we got started back in 2011 looking at some of the critical challenges we face, and one of our mission statements is enable student success. For us, that's fairly well defined by the president and the provost. They would like to achieve 90% freshman retention. About 10 years ago, we were at 64%. In the past year, we've recently reached 85%. So over time, we've been increasing our freshman retention rate using a number of administrative and academic programs. And as part of that, we've introduced the adaptive courseware as another tool in our toolkit. And it's been very helpful to get students through these general education courses that are sometimes referred to as killer courses because they knock out a significant portion of the class that would like to go on and study in sophomore and junior year. As you can see, our objectives are very specific as well. If I go back to that original slide, talk about our success in economics, our goal is to have 90% of those students get a C or better, to reduce that withdrawal rate from 10% all the way down to 5%, and to be able to identify struggling students rapidly. That's where learning objects is very powerful and very helpful because it can help us get inside of that previously black box to help the students figure out what they need to do to succeed. And then we do active learning in class, and I'll talk more about that as well, but basically that's one of our objectives, is to do something where the students are using their critical thinking skills and their decision skills in every class meeting. We'll talk a little bit about our measurement efforts so that you have some context for this, and Jon can weigh in on this as well. We think about measurement as a spectrum of different analyses that we do. And Jon, you want to talk a little bit about program design?
It's very specific. Oh, am I here?
Yeah, go ahead, Jon.
Oh, okay, great, sorry. Yeah, so as Dale mentioned, we started off with a very specific goal around increasing success rates in economics, in particular in the case we're talking about today. And so as we talk about program or course or curriculum design, we have a quality framework that's informed by Quality Matters and the CVEN framework and some of the others that are widely used in the field. But we build that with the idea we want to build with the best quality we can, but with a specific eye toward achieving the goal that we set out to measure at the beginning. So as we go into design, it's with that specific goal in mind, and also making sure that we're instrumenting the technology to gather the data that we'll use to measure our efforts. And then as we go into live, we have some vital signs. We watch to see how things are going. As Dale mentioned, there are our instructor and program owner and other dashboards that people can watch and see how things are doing live. They can focus their efforts and attention to help specific students. But then as that rolls into evaluation, we'll periodically, after say a couple of semesters or some period of time, we'll stop and say, is this really working? Now we're doing some of that live on the fly, but we want to do that more formally at kind of specific junctures in time, and then use that evaluation to continuously improve what we're delivering for faculty and students in the classroom.
Yeah, and so for us, the takeaway working with learning objects is to think holistically and to try to track your efforts across all of these different sets of activities. And when we started the process, we thought about this as a backward design model. So that really required us to sit down with faculty and map out the outcomes, learning activities, and the assessment tools and techniques. This became the backbone of a design that was transferred into learning objects. But I think when you talk to faculty about your efforts, you want to be clear they have to start with this open mind and work their way up through the material. You just don't want to take your existing course and translate it over into a system because they may miss opportunities to evaluate some of these components. And we've tried using adaptive systems in a number of different models. One of the early efforts was a self-paced online version of a math course. And what we found was for 18 and 19-year-olds, they didn't have the discipline necessary to succeed in that model. So we moved to what we call a supervised model. Some of you probably have an Emporium model in math that's similar, where students are in a class with a faculty member and teaching assistants so they can get help immediately. And then finally, that evolved into this adaptive online active in-class model or flipped model that's been successful for us. This has been the most successful in our experience. And if you're familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, we've identified the proper tool for the proper job. One of the beauties of using an adaptive courseware in a flipped model is it takes care of delivering the information on the bottom two layers of Bloom's so that the faculty members have time in class to spend on higher order thinking. In our traditional model, there was never any time for that because we were spending so much time delivering the information in lecture mode and in small group work, things like that. So as this new model has evolved, the faculty members have embraced the idea that they can create activities for students, even freshmen, that allow them to analyze, evaluate, and even create new ideas within the context of the course. So we're really trying to empower the faculty using the adaptive courseware to free them from the lecture model, and then they can use that as they see fit. This plays out as a series of exercises around topics. I use this to describe how a student would experience this. In the adaptive system, they're going to acquire the information. We had our faculty videotape all of their lectures, We loaded those into the adaptive courseware along with all the textbook information, interactive tools, all of the assessment activities. And then the students do some type of analysis where they practice or take a formative assessment to prove that they've learned the material. When they get to class, they're in application mode. We like to use case study model, and we encourage them to work in pairs or in small groups as possible in the lecture hall. But we really want them to be thinking out loud, so that the lecture hall is very noisy, chaotic, and engaging, and the students and the faculty are sharing information freely and getting a much more interactive experience out of that. And then finally, there's some follow-up or assimilation process. Often that's another quiz or an essay, depending on how many students are in the class. It may be a lab assignment if there's a lab associated with the course. And this cycle repeats itself every week, and faculty members have developed a rhythm within their course so that they can get students to focus on doing all the prep before they come to class and then doing all the interaction in class. Now, I want to contrast. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, so we do have a question that came in that's relevant to the slide that you were just on. Yep. The question is, how have you been able to convince faculty to move away from the lecture hall model? You know, it seems hard because that's what they know best.
Yes, it's a transition for faculty, just like it is for students. What we found is that the first part of that conversation is about what they would like to do with the time in class. Often they've been frustrated by the lack of freedom that they've had because they've been completely committed to giving the lecture. So if they are open to doing other things in class, then that creates an opportunity to extend the conversation and develop more details. The second part of that is looking at the data. If we are looking at a 15 to 20% withdrawal rate, faculty members don't want to fail. So they think that if they embrace this new approach, they would have a higher likelihood of success. And that often motivates them because they're looking for ways to improve their results as well. And then finally, I think it requires a great deal of leadership. We found that if a department chair or a senior faculty member embraces the model, it sets a nice tenor for the rest of the faculty. And we use a mentor model to get the faculty up to speed, and we assign them a more experienced active learning teacher. That way they can shadow that person, ask them questions, and get accustomed to it. The last observation I have in this area is it usually takes 3 times through a model to get good at it. A faculty member would start off doing some active learning and maybe uncomfortable initially with the chaos in the classroom and the complexity of managing this large group dynamic now. But over time, they embrace it, and by the 3rd time through a course, they've developed a high level of expertise. So we give them a lot of leeway initially to fail and to take risks because we want them to get comfortable with the process. Those are all parts of the... Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would just add to that, especially on that last part about leadership and the department engaging collectively across not just Arizona State, but other institutions we've worked at. You know, if one faculty member were attempting this by him or herself, it can be daunting. You can feel like you're kind of exposing yourself for doing something crazy that may or may not work. But when there are multiple faculty members working on it together, and there is some leadership from the chair and even the dean to say, we get that this is going to be a transition, like student ratings might drop for a little bit. We're going to figure out how to work our way through that. Having that collective approach as a group of faculty sort of brings everybody along in a way that's much more inclusive and collaborative.
Yeah. In psychology, we started with 200 students, and that doubled to 400, and next fall we're going to have 2,400 students taking the course using this active adaptive approach. Similarly, in economics, we were probably about 200 initially, and then they're going to have 1,200 students in this model in the fall. So it does require a team. We'll talk a little bit more about the support structure later in the discussion, but that was a good question. Thank you. So I want to contrast the LMS and the adaptive courseware, again, to give you some talking points when you're discussing this with your colleagues or with faculty members. The first is that the lesson plan in an LMS is the same for all students. They're going to get the syllabus, they're going to see that. In an adaptive system, there's going to be some variation in that depending on how much the student knows or doesn't at the beginning of the course. In the LMS, the presentation model is a group. It's individualized in the adaptive courseware. And then the content is common in the LMS and personalized in the adaptive system. So as you think about adaptive, I like to contrast the static LMS with a dynamic adaptive system. And the last piece is at the course level, you can have courses in the LMS, you can have entire programs in the adaptive software. We're currently building a vertical that will integrate multiple courses into one adaptive system. So the evolution here is to start with something that you can manage like one course, but eventually you can extend that into an entire program. And the variability and the dynamic nature of the adaptive systems are what help the students to get the optimum learning experience. So I'll talk a little bit about standards, and Jon can weigh in on this as well. You'll recognize these components, I'm sure, in your environment. You can see we start with the LMS and talk about personalized course modules within learning objects. But then within that environment, you see the IMS Global Toolkit. So we've got LTI, we've got CASE, which is the competency mapping system now that they've just released. We've got Caliper, that's something that is also in development and rapidly being implemented at several universities. And then you've got some other standards down here around learner credentials. So this ecosystem that IMS Global is building really helps to connect all the disparate pieces of this environment. Jon, did you have any other comments?
Yeah, sure. I would just say that taking a standards-based approach, I mean, obviously most of the hard work here is getting the curriculum aligned and working together with the faculty on a model. And then when a vendor like Learning Objects comes in, we can institutionalize that as sort of like, here's the online components, here's what will be done in the classroom. But that curriculum outcomes mapping piece is something that we can now start doing in a standards-based way with CASE. So Learning Objects in particular, and I don't think any of the adaptive tools you're using, Dale, would replace the LMS. They're all made to talk with the LMS. So LTI allows us, LTI allows us to sync rosters pretty much instantaneously. And then we can hook up the right learning events, mastery events, other kind of data that we want via Caliper to be driving that into our learner achievement data store and other information that we want to watch. And then in some instances, we want to recognize learner achievement in ways that are more granular than the course. So we can do a badge through OBI or specify an outcome or a competency on the transcript with an extended transcript. So all of those standards make things that would be very complicated and bespoke if we didn't have them pretty rapid to implement, which is the promise of IMS. So we're very happy to have a standards-based implementation here.
And also it's the promise of the adaptive courseware, because you think about the data streams that are now flowing at a very granular level. Individuals being tracked through different instructional resources and against different assessment standards. All of that information can be valuable if you can track it and organize it. So IMS Global provides a nice infrastructure for that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Dan. I just mentioned back a couple of slides ago when you talked about backward design. That is the thing that is different about the adaptive part of this active adaptive model, is we're able to track learners at the learning outcome or even the supporting skill or knowledge component level. So you were commenting, Dale, about section sizes. That curriculum outcomes map and the data underneath it, that's what allows the instructor to see, oh, these 3 students are struggling on this topic today, or overall my students across the entire course are struggling on this concept. But it's that granular mapping and the data feeds that allows you to generate reports like that.
So Dale and John, I've got a two-part question that's come in. So the first part is, and maybe this one, John, you can maybe address this one, is how do you see adaptive tools used in being implemented in terms of a flipped classroom model?
Yeah, I would say the active adaptive model at ASU is a flipped model where you're kind of doing what used to be the lecture online through the tool, and then when you come to class, you're doing different kinds of activities. And that's a model we're seeing gain more and more traction to other places. And you know, there are different flavors and different proportions of what's online versus in the class, and different focuses on what happens in the class. But seeing that the hybrid flipped model is really picking up steam.
Yeah, that's correct. We're using that model.
And so kind of a follow-on to that, Dale, within the research and work that ASU has been doing, do you guys have any assessment data that kind of enables you to find attribution of success in relation to adaptive tools versus maybe a more direct thinking of flipped classroom?
I've got some anecdotal evidence on that, where what I've found is that the persistence variable that I talked about earlier, the lower withdrawal rate, I've found to be attributable to the active learning, because students build a stronger social network when they're interacting with their classmates and they're not just listening to the instructor. So that piece of the puzzle I attribute almost entirely to active learning. And then on the performance side, we've heard from focus group feedback and from student evaluations that they're increasing their success using the adaptive courseware. So that grade of C or better we attribute almost entirely to the adaptive courseware. So that's the way we've thought about it, and that's what students are telling us when we get feedback from them. So I want to talk now a little bit about the benefits of these systems, and there are two customers in quotation marks here. One set is the students. We're trying to respect their knowledge, respond to their needs, and reduce the gaps in their understanding. And we build the particular courseware, in this case psychology, you're looking at, around that idea that not every student needs to see every piece of content. So how do we flex the instructional materials to meet their needs? And sometimes that means they need more and sometimes less. But personalization at that level is a very positive reinforcement for them, because they know if they've had psychology in a previous experience, they might be able to move more quickly through the material. On the faculty side, our other customer, it's the ability to monitor students. John was just describing that granularity, where you can see the 10 students that are struggling the most, and you can ask a teaching assistant to go and help them, or you can focus on them during the class period if they need personal attention. And then on the long-term side, we're thinking about measuring the overall performance of the class, being able to answer the question that was just asked about which of the benefits and the positive effects of an adaptive courseware are translating into good results for the students. So analyzing those things is only possible because we have this new data stream in the adaptive courseware. And this is an example of where students are being tracked, and you can see when their last activity was, when the overall progress is, and what their current grade is. So as you think about the scaling process, the ability to scan a list of students quickly and find the ones that are struggling is really important when we're dealing with large section sizes. Now, adaptive courseware works well in the flipped model. We obviously like that model. It's given us the best results. But you can also use it in other environments. So I want to encourage you to explore other ways to apply adaptive courseware. If you have a faculty member who says, I'm going to continue lecturing, well, there's still adaptive homework and adaptive assessment tools out there. In a flipped model, we do everything in the adaptive courseware, so information delivery as well as the assessment. Online, you can do all three in there, the homework as well. And then from a program design delivery standpoint, if you are evolving with your faculty and if you are having this conversation, you can say our ultimate goal is to develop a fully integrated approach that will allow the students to remediate back to material that they may have covered in a previous week or maybe even a previous semester, or also move forward if they understand the material. So think about adaptive courseware as a toolkit that's available to meet your specific needs, and then you can explore these options with your faculty members. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the choices that you have at the outset of this process. Think about it as construct versus configure. You're going to be offered opportunities to build systems like we did with learning objects. The biggest challenges are the time and the cost. Faculty members are busy people, obviously have multiple activities underway and conflicting interests. So as you think about how much work is required, and building a system from scratch usually requires 6 to 9 months to fully develop all the instructional resources, integrate them into the courseware, and then test it. You take on a lot of risk when you do that. On the configuration model, if you have something that's close, let's say you like the economics course, but there are 2 or 3 weeks that the faculty member would like to change, then it might be much faster for you to adopt the 80% that works for that faculty member and just modify the 20% that needs adjustment. You're going to have constraints. Obviously, you're not going to get the full flexibility, but it's so much faster and so much safer to do something like that. We've done both, and I find faculty like to make some small adjustments, even if it is a configuration model. So there's always going to be a little bit of personalization that goes on behalf of the faculty members. The key is to remember the scale of the commitment before you commit to a particular project, and to have that conversation with the professor before you embark on that. If they come to you with a solution and say, I've been talking to the vendor or the publisher and they say they have this solution, do your due diligence to try to evaluate how much work would be required so that you can prepare the professor properly and you don't get shocked a month down the road when they throw up their hands in frustration and claim they didn't understand how much work was going to be required.
Yeah, Dale, and I just add to that quickly that, you know, thinking of this as a curriculum redesign project, just forget the technology for a second and just think of what it would take if you were going to redesign one of your high enrolling courses or a sequence of courses. It's a large amount of work, and just because there's a technology tool doesn't mean that that's going to go faster. In fact, it means it might go a little bit slower. So if you think of it in that context, and then make sure to talk to the vendor about, well, what do you already have that's quote unquote done? Where have you done this before? Can we get a jump start by piggybacking off something else, right? So those are great questions, but it is important to consider the amount of work that goes into this.
So let's pick up there. Yeah, go ahead, Sam.
Dale? Yeah, this is Sam. This might relate more to the 2 slides behind. I apologize. The question was, is this approach applicable for teaching students with exceptionality, including people with disabilities? Maybe the approach can be modified based on, you know, whatever the student needs. So this might relate more to delivery, whether that be lecture, the steps that you outlined in two slides back.
Yeah, the goal is the same as universal design, you know, the ability to provide every student with an equivalent experience. To some degree, an adaptive courseware has an advantage in that if you include all of the video material, you can use transcripts. And if you have everything in a text reader format, you can use all of the necessary tools to help the students with that. So we found that if you're trying to compare apples to apples, it's probably more effective than having a student sit in a lecture hall and try to follow a lecture one time without the ability to hit a rewind button go back and either reread or listen to that lecture again. So it's really supportive of students that have disabilities or need additional support to be successful.
Great, thank you.
Yep. So let's talk a little bit about that process. John was alluding to this. Now you've got a faculty member, you're going to have instructional designers, technologists, vendor personnel, graphic designers, video producers, librarians, and leaders all involved in this conversation. What we found is every time we've constructed a course, the vendors have had a team in parallel with our team, so they will have an instructional designer that's paired with ours. They're going to have a subject matter expert to support our faculty member. They're going to have video production people to make sure the videos get loaded properly in their system. All of these folks are involved in the process, and that's why it takes longer and requires a great deal more effort than a traditional LMS setup process. And on leadership, what I found is it takes 3 layers of leaders to be successful. You're going to have your department chair. That person is probably the most important person in the conversation because they're the ones who make decisions about faculty assignments. You're going to have the dean involved because there's a lot of money probably being invested in either buying out faculty time or offering them a lower course load. And you're going to have provost level leadership involved because if we're talking about general education courses, you're talking about large enrollments. At Arizona State, there's 5,000 students in psychology. There's another 5,500 in economics. There's another 5,500 in college algebra. These are large courses that affect a significant portion of the freshman class. So everybody wants to be sure it's working, and you have to plan accordingly. So we describe it as a team sport. It's not a solo anymore, and we have faculty members who aren't accustomed to working on teams. So acculturating them to this process and helping them understand the value of each of these other personnel is important to get off on the right foot. Finally, I'll just wrap up by saying what we've proven over the last 5 years is that personalization can improve performance. And the professors are the ones who need to redesign this learning process. It's going to be all about the teachers. They're the ones who control the technology, and it's not the other way around. I've finished with this graph, and give me a second to try to orient you. There are 34 lessons in this course running from August to December. And during the class, you'll notice that some students could finish within 4 weeks. This was a college math class where we used a self-paced model. So for a student that's done within the first 4 weeks, there's no reason for them to be sitting in a classroom any longer. They can move on and study the other 4 subjects that they have to successfully complete. So we've learned from this data that while some students are successful early on, others require a little bit of encouragement and additional support. And later in the semester, when we submit academic status reports to the administration to let them know students are falling behind or struggling, then that usually motivates the students to pick up their game and to finish up the course. But we know now that not every student is at the same place at the same time. So when we're empowered with that information, we have to adjust the teaching process. And that's what we've done, is to respond to the information and the knowledge that students need this personalization and to build the necessary systems, pedagogy, and support structure for the faculty to be successful. So with that, we'll finish up with some more questions, and I'll be happy to follow up by email if you'd like as well. If you have anything you'd like to ask about specifically, let me know. Sam, do we need any more?
Yeah, so John, we did have a couple questions that came in, more specific about learning objects.
Sure.
So one of them is, are the curriculum outcomes that are built within the learning object software, are they also built or shared with the LMS?
It depends on the architecture of the LMS and its ability to receive that, but if the LMS can receive those in case standard format, or if they're authored in case standard format and then we can consume those. That's the world we would love to see. We're not quite there yet, but we do, as any engagement with an institution, a discovery process about what specific LMS do you have, what outcomes management processes do you have, and we do our best to make sure that we're integrated with standards as the strong preference from the outset.
And we do not try to integrate Blackboard with learning objects. We use LTI to allow for single sign-on, but we don't share the learning objectives or any of that data back to the LMS, just the assessment results.
So just a quick note for those of you that may not be familiar with what CASE is. CASE is the Competency Academic Standards Exchange, and I've asked Kara to post the URL to the webpage on the IMS website that talks more specifically about CASE, since we probably won't have time to dig into that at our time together this afternoon. So, but thank you, John and Dale, for that response. We also had a couple of questions. One question is, can someone talk a little bit more to the tooling used in creating adaptive courseware?
Yes, we use a technique called the CDD, which is the course design document, and it's just a series of templates that we share with the faculty so they can build each lesson around those three elements: the learning objective, the instructional resource, and the assessment activities. And they essentially create everything in a static format, and then that material gets loaded by the learning objects instructional designer into their technology so that it can then flow to the student. But that first CDD process is one that LO created to facilitate this so that faculty members didn't have to work directly in the adaptive courseware.
Yeah, and I would just say, you know, we have a similar process that we would deploy with any institution. And as Dale said, we want to protect faculty from having to be programmers or, you know, in the weeds of building these connections. But we think it's critically important that they are the ones who are saying, yes, these are the outcomes for our program. These are the supporting outcomes. Here are the activities that we think are aligned with that. Here are the assessments that we think are aligned with that. That's the purpose of that documentation. So they can help us map that out. We can serve as advisors saying, hey, we might be short on activities for this outcome or short on assessments for this one. But when we get all of that material, then we have a team of folks that would build that out.
And I would add that the courses that we're talking about here, psychology and economics, were a blend of a textbook provided by Cengage and the videos from our faculty members and the assessment questions from another product called ATP, the Adaptive Test Prep Kit within the Cengage library. So we were able to blend disparate resources together into one cohesive student experience.
And just a couple of final pieces before we part ways this afternoon, since we are almost to the end of our time. One person asked about an IMS standard for AI or machine learning. My understanding is the CASE standard actually grew out of the K-12 need to do machine-readable machine learning mapping. So if whoever posted this question, I'm happy to carry on and dig a little deeper into that with you outside of this conversation, and can follow up with you about that.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Sam.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I would just add to that what CASE was an effort to bring together both, like you're saying, that K-12 adaptive thread with what was more prominent in higher ed at the time, the competency-based approach. And so they both have kind of this undergirding need to have a curriculum map, and then data could be fed into those from a variety of sources, machine learning, whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we also had, so first off, I'd like to thank John and Dale for spending some time with us this afternoon. and Dale for sharing, what is happening at ASU. I think this is some very exciting research and things that are coming out about the impact of adaptive learning and the potential role that IMS standards have. I would like to let everyone know that IMS does have a community of practice. We call it Innovation Leadership Network around adaptive learning, and if you'd like more information on that, you can reach out to me, and I can put my email in chat. But also, Jon, thank you for lending your expertise as well. This is a very exciting opportunity to share this with our audience this afternoon. We had several people ask if it was possible to see some examples. Those examples of, of the problem sets varied on base of performance, as well as, what a class design might look like. So I would suggest that they can either reach out to us or we can help facilitate that glimpse into that with Jon and Dale, or this also might be a great topic for a future webinar to be able to get a little deeper in the weeds of what does a good adaptive learning course look like. So if anyone else has any comments, that would be great. I also wanted to remind everyone that IMS's Executive Conference, Learning Impact Leadership Institute, will be at the end of the month, May 21st through the 24th. We will be in Baltimore this year. If you are unfamiliar with this conference, it's a great conference. We have about 500 to 600 participants. We have 125 sessions across 10 tracks, as well as keynotes and lightning speakers. And I think one of the things that sets Learning Impact apart is the staff and the member institutions, as we set the agenda, work really hard to make this and provide things that universities and institutions can take away and apply back on their campuses. So for more information, you could see our website under events. But again, I'd like to thank everyone for your time this afternoon and hope to see you at a future webinar, and have a wonderful week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.